Hello again, dear fellow YouTubers, and happy and blessed Sunday, according to local time, from Metro Manila, the Philippines, Southeastern Asia. Former US Vice President Mike Pence at last did on Friday, February the 4th, 2022, what he should have done over 1 year ago. He should have admitted that the November 2020 US presidential election indeed was a free and fair one, and therefore its results also were valid. In other words, the incumbent US president and his boss at the time, Donald Trump, truly was defeated by former US Vice President Joseph Biden. Unfortunately, he stopped short of declaring outright that Biden is the legitimate president of the US, but the implication was there. And given the fact that Pence served as the US vice president, so a heartbeat away from the presidency, to use that old American political cliche, for 4 years from January 2017 to January 2021, and Pence has at last publicly distanced himself from Trump's biggest lie, his egregious and totally false claim that supposedly he was re-elected, and even by a clear margin, in November 2020. This could spell trouble for Trump in his effort to get re-elected as the US president in November 2024, and therefore to serve a separate 4-year term, second 4-year term from January 2025 to January 2029. Of course, given the fact that Trump is visibly overweight and is already in his 70s, and he would be 78 at the time of his second or actually third presidential campaign, of course, he could have physical ailments. In the worst case scenario, he could even die. And then under the more benign scenarios, he could either experience a heart attack or stroke, or then milder cardiovascular problems. He could be diagnosed with adult type diabetes. He could fall badly and injure himself, or he could just have such a deep depression that he could lose interest in politics, or he could at last truly become a humble and wholehearted and sincere follower of Jesus Christ and disavow politics, political involvement, and instead dedicate the remainder of his life to witnessing about Jesus, which would be a wonderful outcome for him, meaning Donald Trump, but also would glorify Jesus Christ a lot. Or then Trump could be tied down into several lawsuits which involve his business empire, and he could even be named as a defendant in one or more of them, because he's alleged to have defrauded the US federal government and one or more state governments out of at least millions of dollars, perhaps even billions of dollars during his decades as a businessman. He has fought for years against having his tax returns released, something that many previous US presidents would never have done. They have duly published their tax returns, and then there has been relatively little public discussion of them. So all these steps, his efforts to hold on to the presidency, US presidency, just about at any cost, and then his efforts to prevent the release of his tax records and even the release of his telecommunications messages on that fateful day, January the 6th, 2021, when at least tens, if not hundreds of thousands of fanatical supporters of his converged in Washington, D.C., and hundreds of them were able to invade the congressional building through various broken windows. All these actions indicate that he has serious misdeeds, sins to hide, probably even crimes to hide. And already because of these ethical and legal problems, he should never be re-elected US president again. In the worst case scenario, he could even be imprisoned during his remaining lifetime. But we'll leave that aside. Anyway, as a Finnish reporter, Mr. Otso Huttunen, whose column or article on this admission by Pence that Trump indeed had lost, even though Pence did not explicitly use those terms, as that Finnish journalist suggested, Pence probably stopped short of declaring flat out that Trump indeed lost the 2020 US presidential elections and Biden won them in order to maintain some kind of connection to that right-wing section of the Republican Party who still strongly supports Donald Trump, so that in case Mike Pence wants to run for president in 2024, which is possible, as a lighter version of Trump, he could well need those fanatical Trumpists' votes, or enough of them, in order to defeat any liberal, moderate, and centrist Republican or progressive Republican candidates for the party's presidential nomination, whom he could face in addition to Mr. Trump, and then possibly some other conservative/populist Republicans. But after my introduction, let's go to the actual article. HillReporter.com is the source. After 6 months, Pence finally rejects Trump's big lie and defends certifying election. Okay, but this is actually from June the 25th, 2021, sorry. But I'll try to then couple this with another article. I'll have to add it later to this video's description part. Okay. Yeah, I was able to find the article on CNN. But let's read briefly, or I'll read briefly and comment on this earlier article. Anyway, the other one is on Edition, on the website edition.cnn.com by journalists Steve Contorno and Eric Branch on February the 5th, 2022, to that earlier article that was published over 7 months ago. So in late June 2021, former US Vice President Mike Pence had at last stated that he was proud to have certified the Electoral College results that declared Joe Biden president. So already then, Pence had obviously and directly rejected Trump's big lie that the November 2020 election, meaning US presidential election, was supposedly stolen from him. So Pence made this announcement to a group of fellow Republicans at the Ronald Reagan Presidential Library in Simi Valley, California, saying, and I quote, "I will always be proud that we did our part on that tragic day," meaning January the 6th, 2021, when, as a result of those various incitements that Donald Trump and his fanatical allies had given to the equal, if not even more fanatical Trump supporters, including a speech made by Donald Trump earlier on January the 6th, 2021. And as a result, thousands of them, if not tens of thousands, marched to Capitol Hill, and hundreds were able to break inside, with the tragic result that 4 protesters died, one directly, Ashley Babbitt, a former Air Force veteran, by the way, because she tried to climb through a broken window into a private area just outside the lobby, just outside the 2 chambers of Congress, the U.S. House of Representatives and the U.S. Senate. And then an African-American Capitol Police officer who was under distress because there were tens of other protesters right beside and behind Mrs. Babbitt, and who had no immediate way of knowing that Mrs. Babbitt was indeed unarmed. And because Mrs. Babbitt had disobeyed his order to stay behind those doors. So defensively, not to kill Mrs. Babbitt, but to render her harmless, he shot Babbitt around the left, or between her left shoulder and her neck, with the tragic result that she quickly lost consciousness. She was bleeding profusely, and although she was quickly rushed to a Washington, D.C. hospital, she passed away later that day. And then one other fanatical Trump supporter died of a drug overdose. Whether it was an intentional death, in other words, a suicide, or an accidental one, we don't know. 2 others died of stress-induced heart attacks, and then one of the U.S. Capitol or Washington, D.C. police officers died in his office at his desk of a stress-induced heart attack. So there were 5 totally unnecessary deaths, 4 of which, especially Mrs. Babbitt's death, have been idolized in various far-right, right-wing populist, nativist, and deeply anti-democratic, both big D and small d democratic circles, inside and outside the United States. To reconvene the Congress and fulfilled our duty under the Constitution and the laws of the United States. Just a week earlier, speaking at another conservative Republican gathering, Pence had been shouted down and heckled, with many in the audience still calling him, and get this, already over 5 months after that tragic day, a traitor for not reversing the election results to give Trump another term as president. Theoretically, Pence could have done that, but then he would have violated the Constitution, and he would actually have deserved to be impeached and removed from office. Trump, unfortunately, has led his supporters to believe that Pence could have taken such action, which is another big lie on his part. Pence stated, "Now there are those in our party who believe that in my position as presiding officer over the joint session," meaning the joint session of the U.S. House of Representatives and the U.S. Senate, "that I possess the authority to reject or return electoral votes certified by the states." Pence said without directly naming Trump, probably in order not to be branded a rhino, a Republican in name only, or a traitor, or a never Trump Republican. Never mind the fact that he did vote for Donald Trump both times, in 2016 and 2020, in those 2 U.S. presidential elections where so far Trump has been the presidential candidate. And he stated correctly, "The Constitution provides the Vice President with no such authority before the joint session of Congress, and the truth is there's almost no idea more un-American than the notion that any one person could choose the American president. The presidency belongs to the American people and the American people alone." I would say amen. And the presidential election should be decided at the ballot box and then in the 50 respective state capitals and in Washington, D.C. So, uh, peacefully, freely, and fairly by voting both first to elect the presidential electors, and then the presidential electors will do their constitutional duty and normally, without any exceptions, vote for those candidates to whom they have been pledged. End of story. And then on January the 6th, 2021, the presidential election results will be certified, unless that day is a Sunday, uh, in which case I think they would choose the Friday, which is closest to it. Yeah, or something like that anyway. Or maybe the Saturday, I'm not sure. Previously, Pence's most forceful repudiation of Trump's position was when he declared that he and his former boss may never see eye to eye, in other words, be close friends again, about the events, or being close agreement again about the events of the deadly January the 6th insurrection. But let's get to that CNN article by journalists Steve Contorno and Eric Brander, published on February the 5th, 2022. Lake Buena Vista, or Good View, Florida. Former Vice President, meaning US Vice President, of course, Mike Pence, called out his former boss by name on Friday, saying that President Trump is wrong in claiming that Pence had the right to overturn the 2020 US presidential election on January the 6th, 2021. Speaking at the Federalist Society Florida chapter's conference near Orlando, Pence delivered his strongest response yet to Trump's ongoing efforts to relitigate the 2020 US presidential election, never mind the fact that it has been certified already. And all the recounts, albeit partial, have confirmed Biden's victory, as have all the official reports on the election, calling it un-American and suggest that one person could have decided the outcome. As I have said more than once to my students at the international school, where by God's grace I've been teaching since August 2019 here in Metro Manila, the Philippines, Southeastern Asia, Trump would be more fit to be the leader, the president of an authoritarian dictatorship, where indeed he would face little effective opposition, either from the opposition politicians or even from the mass media, than to be the president of a genuine democracy like the United States. Pence warned against conservatives, meaning right-wing Republicans, who continue to insist the vice president can alter an election, and said it could be a problematic position for Republicans in the next presidential election, and I totally agree. Under the Constitution, I had no right to change the outcome of our election, and Vice President Kamala Harris will have no right to overturn the election when we beat them in 2024. Well, that is not yet definite, Mr. Pence. But that was what he said. Pence's remarks followed one of Trump's latest attempts to blame the failed attempt to overturn the 2020 US presidential election on his former vice president. Once again, Trump refuses to take responsibility. He refuses to, at least publicly, to admit the truth. Let's really pray that he will, by God's grace, repent of his many sins before it's too late. In a statement last Sunday, meaning on January the 30th, 2022, Trump suggested that a recent bipartisan push to revise the counting of electoral college votes by Congress was proof that Pence had the power to change the results. Now, true bipartisan in the US political context means involving both Democrats and Republicans. So I really hope and pray that the good Lord will have mercy on the American people and on the other inhabitants of this planet Earth and do whatever it takes to prevent Donald Trump from ever again serving as the US president. May God bless and protect, guide and forgive and strengthen all of you.